I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land and pay my respects to all our elders, past and present, and emerging leaders and elders. And I extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islands peoples.
Wanjara. Good morning again. My name's Brady for Kunjur Men's Group. We're broadcasting out of Cairns, North Queensland, far North Queensland. Beautiful place to live. Kunjur Men's Group is a community-based group, and we've always been fundamentally a grassroots organisation. We will remain that, grassroots, because that is where the need is great. And we want to be able to bring the stories, the feelings, the understanding on how things came up to be and where things are going. From the grassroots level, Kunjur Men's Group is who we are. And today, my special guest is Brin Matthews. Good morning, Brin.
Good morning, Graham. It's a pleasure to be here talking to you again.
Yes, and it's great to see. I've worked with Brin in the past, and we've had many good times looking into the water management of the Mitchell River, and we'll go into that. And that's one of our subject matters, is that how Aboriginal people are to manage the country, or what could be our involvement in country. And Brin was very instrumental in one of the working cogs in trying to get our people involved in the management of country. But here, this is where I want to start. I think we've got to start from the beginning, Brin. And would you please give the listeners and the viewers a bit of history about it, where you come from,
Yep.
and why you do things that you do?
Right. Well, I grew up in Colac in Western District, Victoria, and most of my ancestors arrived there in the 1850s. A lot of them left North Devon in England during the potato famine, because it hit England as well as Ireland at the same time. And my great-great-grandfather and my great-great-grandmother both came from families of over a dozen kids. So things were pretty desperate when they came out to Australia. And they settled not far from Colac initially and set up a dairy farm. And as I grew up and wandered around where I lived, I noticed evidence of Aboriginal activity. And it made me realise that there were other people who had been living on this country before we got there. I mean, one of the things just up the road near the rifle range was there was bora ground. And it was still very evident, this was back in the 1950s and 60s, that this is what it was. It was a big one as well, because the lake had a lot of eels, fish, freshwater shellfish, etc. in it, so it would have been a really important gathering site. And then walking through the Otways, I found evidence of quarrying for stone tools and stuff, and including the most impressive was this really big sharpening stone, about the size of a small car, that had grooves in the top of it that you could put your finger right into, where people had been basically sharpening points for thousands of years.
Yeah, and that's usually evidence of long time occupation, isn't it?
Absolutely. And you look at it and you go, oh, this is amazing. This is like...
How old were you?
Oh, this is when I was a Boy Scout, when I was in my teens.
In your teens, yeah.
Yeah.
So you were pretty well aware in that adolescent part of your life.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Yeah, I grew up with a really strong sense of justice from my father. My father was always active in community groups, and then he got on the council and he was a mayor for a while and so forth. So he was very active in trying to engage the community and make the community a better place for everybody. But as far as Aboriginal people, there just weren't any in the area at all.
You have a Celtic background?
Yes, and Scandinavian as well, some Viking too.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, definitely. Definitely, I've got a sense of relationship to country and earth that goes right back sort of to the pre-Christian times of those communities anyway.
And you was telling me, we was having a quick yarn before we got on air, how you revisited your part of the country, where your family,
yeah,
and visited a burial site?
Yeah. Well, one place I visited, this is a trip I did when my daughter was actually only 1 year old. We got a camper van and we went to North Devon and went to the village cemetery from where my great-great-grandparents had emigrated to Australia. And there was just rows and rows of them, of these families all lined up in this cemetery. And I thought, crikey, this is where my mom came from. You know?
Sense of place?
Yeah, absolutely. It gave me a real sense of place. Like this was country where I had roots. And it was really interesting because there were places in Australia where I felt really comfortable, more than other places where I didn't feel comfortable. And one of the places I felt comfortable was Birregurra, which is between Geelong and Colac. And then the other place is just down the road here, around the back of Mount Quincan.
Oh, right.
And that looks just like this country in North Devon.
Wow.
It really does. It was quite I didn't realise why I really liked those places until I'd gone back there and seen that.
Okay. Well, that's the beauty of planet Earth, is that you can be in one part of the Earth and it looks like home.
Yep.
I've experienced that when I went overseas. I've seen gum trees in different places in Hong Kong and places like that, and it sort of made me feel like home. So planet Earth is very special, but we probably need to whittle our thoughts down to our involvement.
Yep.
Myself and yourself, our involvement, and especially with how Aboriginal people, how we came and progressed down through the years. There has been many different things, dramatic things that have happened to our people, and one that always sticks out is the Gurindji people. And you've had some contact and some involvement with the Wave Hill walk-off?
We'll call it a near miss.
A near miss, okay.
Yeah, in the sense that I was doing engineering at Monash University, and at the end of first year, one of my colleagues in engineering said, a group of us are going up to this place called Waddy Creek, and we're going to be putting in a water supply for this Gurindji mob who've walked off Wave Hill Station. Because, I mean, I'd been to land rights demos in Melbourne and overnight sit-ins and so forth, and so I knew what some of the issues were, but I didn't go. I ended up spending the summer carting hay for money.
Okay.
And I always kicked myself ever since for not doing that, because it would have been such an amazing experience to be up there at the end of 1968 and helping make Waddy Creek a more livable space for them, those that had walked off for the Gurindji.
Yeah, of course. Watershed moment, points in history that leave a mark. And I've done that in my recent podcast where I mentioned Old Man Lingiari and the Gurindji people who made their stand to, especially against multinationals like the Vesties that were empowering their wealth within certain parts of the country and making it known, was never shy to say that we hold sway over you, we hold the big stick, you will do what we say. Old Man Lingiari said, no, you won't. It affected you in a big way?
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing was that when I ended up living in England in the 1980s, I made baskets for a living and I sold them in a village in Gloucestershire called Cirencester. And Vesty would come in, or his wife more often than him, would come and buy stuff off me because they owned a whole village just down the road. And just like the way they treated the Gurindji was the same way they treated their tenants in their village. It was their village, they ran it, you did what they said.
Wow, so this is landlord stuff.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. So it wasn't just blackfellas were treated badly.
Yeah.
It was anyone he could push around.
But I suppose that's what entitlement is, and how there've always been the different classes of people, but we always been of the one thought, and it sort of reflects on to us Indigenous people here in Australia, is that we've never ever saw ourselves as a hierarchy of haves and have-nots. And I suspect that because of that understanding coming here, your mob have suffered that before we suffered.
Yep. Well, certainly the people that came to Australia didn't come, most of them, because they were rich and they were going to set up businesses and stuff. They
But the workers
came because they were starving and they were poor.
But I've always had this as a analytic view, is that when we talk about a stolen generation, when we talk about being ripped from your country, being placed under subjection, I'll go straight back to the tried and proven method, is that the convicts were in the same boat. They were taken away from their family. They were taken away from their country. They were subjected to harsh things, and it was under cruel subjection and conditions that they existed too. So proven and tried methods have been shared, not from coming from England and from your ancestor, but it has also reverberated here and continued, because we still see the same hierarchy at play.
Yeah, well, when you mention stolen generation, you've got to sort of also think about the genera and the kids that were taken out of England during the war and immediately after the war and told their parents had died and they were orphans.
Yeah.
And put in those awful institutions.
Yes.
In Western Australia and New South Wales, and just infamous, those places now.
Yeah.
So, again, I mean, that was the churches running that.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And there's intergenerational trauma happening there.
Yep.
So please, for our viewers, our listeners, it does not just affect us as Indigenous people. It affects human beings in general. And I've always brought that to the fore, is that we got to look at this as a holistic view of human oppression. That is another full-on discussion, but we're going to go and we're going to talk about our involvement in protecting the planet.
We said we didn't want to get bogged down in
the sad stuff. So we're looking at positive stuff now.
Absolutely, yeah.
So your work within the environment sector, give us a bit of insight.
Yeah, well, I actually graduated in chemical engineering because there wasn't such a thing as environmental science or environmental engineering back in the 1960s and 70s. And I got into pollution control in Tasmania and worked there for three and a half years or so. And that was back in the days when the Queenstown smelters were still running.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, Tasmania was a really dirty place in the 1970s. They had discharges of the most awful stuff straight out of pipes into Bass Strait off Burnie. And if you lived in certain valleys in Burnie and the wind blew in certain directions, you had to shut all your windows and doors because you get acid fumes coming into your house. I mean, it was rough. There was one place at Devonport, there was a quarry that when he blasted, he put rocks through people's roofs.
Wow, that close.
Yeah, I know. It's just outrageous. And it's obviously tightened up a lot since then. But back in the wild old days, the early days of pollution control, it was there was a lot of stuff to fix, a hell of a lot of stuff. So I started there, and then I went overseas for about a decade. I lived in England and made baskets for a living, which is a very different lifestyle, obviously.
Yeah.
And had a family and all, and then ended up the usual story. You get married, you get divorced, you have kids, and you move on. You move on.
Yeah.
I came back to Australia and got back into the pollution management in Victoria. Worked for EPA there for about 5 years before I moved up to Cairns and started working for the government up here. Now, one of the things I really looked forward to in moving to Cairns was actually the opportunity to work with Indigenous communities, because all the ones in Cape York and the Torres Strait Islands, what we were dealing with waste disposal, water supply, water treatment, sewage treatment, motor vehicle workshops, quarries, and basically industries that could cause pollution, and trying to help the communities run them in a more sustainable way. And some of the issues that came up were just really unique to Indigenous communities, like one Indigenous community that's not on land that it is actually the traditional owner of is quarrying a hill with burial sites of the adjacent Indigenous community whose country it is. And until, I used to talk to myself, look, you've got to have a cultural heritage management plan so you can put a stop to it. And I mean, it was main roads and it was local councils and so forth. And it was just this sort of, I was surprised. I was really surprised by it, that there was this lack of understanding of the importance of your neighbour's cultural heritage.
Yes.
That you'd actually quarry a hill that had burial sites on it.
Yeah, and because of the terrain, the developers of these sites would often use heavy machinery, and we know the impact of what heavy machinery does. It just goes in there, bores, rips, and takes away, and it does not discriminate. So you identified that. What was your role in trying to empower Aboriginal people?
Well, I talked to the council about it. I told them, look, unless you do your own cultural heritage survey, then you can try and work within the cultural heritage legislation to protect it. But until then, I mean, it's like the same problem we've got with threatened species. Unless it's identified as a threatened species and it's on a list somewhere, it doesn't exist.
Yes.
So you've got to get the stuff identified. Then you've got to come up with management plans to say, we don't want to quarry within 200 metres of this, et cetera, et cetera. But no, those were sort of some of the unique issues that came up. And then there's obviously the other issues of the resettlement of people from the islands to the NPA.
Yes.
To Bamaga.
We're talking about Marpoon here.
Well, no, not really, not Marpoon.
But we're taken from one side of the Cape.
From Seisha, and we're talking from Boigu, really.
Boigu, okay.
And Saibai, because there were a couple of instances where there were some really king tides, and they just decided that the island was going to go under, so they moved a lot of people off. And they put them in Bamaga and Seisha.
Yes.
So a lot of them never went back, and those communities are still trying to survive, and they're still trying to keep the tides back on Boigu and Saibai.
Rock walls.
Yep, and it's just like hopeless, because no matter how big a rock wall you put, it goes around the end of it.
But I was talking about the displacement of the Mapoon people and being moved from old Mapoon to new Mapoon, and it's probably the same thing. The environmental impact, whether it's nature produced or man-made, it's the same thing. It still comes down to displacement.
Absolutely.
Because we're talking now climate change, which back then I think it was back in the 80s or something, it was called the greenhouse effect. That was sort of brought to attention.
Well, the Mapoon story I thought was absolutely bloody shocking when I heard it, was that essentially the federal government, it created a thing called the Comelco Act, and it gave Comelco this enormous lease to mine bauxite on, and it wanted them to have a lease that was empty of Indigenous communities. So they basically sent the police and the army in to remove the Mapoon community so that they wouldn't get in the way of the bauxite mining.
Burned the houses.
Burnt the church.
The church and everything. 4 a.m, we know of families that was moved out of there, and there is documented stories of these families surviving this horrific act of seeing their families being moved out early hours of the morning, Gestapo tactics again. So we've not only seen the heavy-handedness of what imperialism has produced, but we also notice that when we have the marches, the rights to life advocacy, because that's where you come in. If it wasn't for like-minded people like you, we would be on our own. But we have to thank a lot of these ones like Henry Reynolds, and we can name a couple, doesn't come to mind at the moment, but ones in places of understanding that could say this is what is happening, and they shone light for us to help us to understand. And you worked at the Mitchell River Protection
Watershed Management Group.
Watershed Management. We didn't, because of native title, it had to occur that we have visitation rights. Yeah, that was a bit tokenistic. We could we couldn't form enterprise and all that, but one thing we could do is be involved in protection, and this is where I started working with you.
Yep. Yeah. Well, the thing that I found really quite early on, there were a couple of things. I mean, there was the Mabo Act.
Yes.
And one of the things that came out of the Mabo Act was one of the judges actually gave an opinion. Essentially, he said that because there wasn't a treaty, and now that terra nullius was overruled, there was essentially no sound legal foundation to Australian law.
Okay.
Which I thought was very interesting. Essentially, he said that it's built on our acceptance of it, not on any really strong basis.
No evidence?
No, because if you accept that terra nullius was wrong, then all the laws that were created before then just weren't right. They just had no grounds, no basis.
So they come in with an assumption, you were saying, assumption that the superiority rests with the Western system of things.
Well, no, you guys didn't exist until 1967.
Exactly. We've always said that, especially our big brother there, Brother Bernie Singleton. I never became a human being till 1967, even though he was 19 years of age.
So there's a couple of things to this treaty thing.
Yeah.
One of them is that it's really important that White Australia and Black Australia sits down and works through this, the truth-telling, the sorry stuff, the apologies, whatever's needed, the compensations, whatever's needed to try and actually say, what we did was wrong, we want to fix it, we want to live together much more amicably without you guys suffering the inequalities you are, health-wise, income-wise, welfare-wise, the lack of social justice, about all those issues. That's one aspect of the treaty. But the other aspect of the treaty is because of this problem with the law, that until the treaties are signed, that's always in the background, that there's this doubt about the validity of all of Australia's legal structures. And this is one of the Mabo opinions. You can read it. And I just read it and I just went, what? It's sort of quite amazing that it wasn't the dominant opinion at the time of the judges.
Yeah.
But it was an opinion. So, so there's definitely the other judges going, well, we're not going to look at that.
So it might have been Justice French being a part of that opinion as well?
Yeah.
Because he was the first justice to roll out the native title.
Yeah, well, potentially, I don't remember which judge it was, but it's like the elephant in the room.
Yeah.
That because of the fact that Indigenous sovereignty now has never been extinguished.
Yeah.
It still exists, regardless of what anyone says. It has never been extinguished. It has to actually go through a treaty process for White Australia to have the right to live here almost.
And I've always had a bit of a problem with the treaty process, especially with the word treaty and what it entails. The way I've sort of opted to view it is that wars had to occur between two parties to be able to come to an agreement, and the appropriate agreement would be a treaty. But there was undeclared war in this country.
Yeah.
Sovereignty was not extinguished.
But there was definitely a war and there was conquest. That's for sure.
So you would say that in the eyes of Western law, that occurred.
There was, yeah.
Okay.
And but see, the thing that the Brits did everywhere else in all the rest of the empire was they sat down with the people that they conquered, and they had a treaty.
Okay.
They did it in India, they did it in Africa, they did it in America. But here they said, well, we can't find anyone to talk to. This mob's too disorganised because your community was so decentralised and dispersed.
We did not operate the way as king and queen.
Yeah.
And that's why in my last podcast I brought about the breastplates and how they put it around a prominent person, especially it was mainly the ones that would talk for the family.
Yep.
And okay, so you must be some form of authority here. In our law, we need to have an authority that we could say, I'm going to have you in subjection to me. I'm going to bestow this king plate to you. You are the king. I come and tell you that you are now in subjection to our law.
Yep.
That's what I've done in the last podcast, and I've said that as a subtle way of justifying the treaty.
Yep.
Now, I'd like to have your view on that. So when we approach the issue of treaty, what would be the benefits, knowing that treaties have been broken, promises along the way, rearranged? So, even the word treaty is flimsy and can be mismanaged. It can be torn up and re-evaluated again. How do we go about it?
Okay. Well, historically, I mean, when they got to America, they found that the Indian tribes actually almost had their own Commonwealth or Parliament.
That's right.
They had their nations. They met together. They sorted things out. And if they couldn't sort it out,
they had chief.
They had a war.
They had chief. But
yeah, absolutely.
We had no chiefs in this country.
Yeah, but they also had a system of relating to each other.
Yes.
Like the Iroquois Nation and the Mohawk Nation was a group of all these different tribes and so forth. But they didn't have that. In Australia, they couldn't find that.
No.
In India,
it was non existent.
In India, they had the Rajas.
They had the Raj, yes.
And they could go to them and they say, you're either with us or we'll shoot you.
That's right. And that was the same, that's the gesture of putting a king plate.
Yep, exactly.
Around their neck and say, okay.
Yeah, but that was back then. That was hundreds of years ago.
Yeah, that's right.
Now we've got the United Nations. We've got the International Charter of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
Yes.
We've got human rights charters. We've got all these other things that sort of behaviour of writing a treaty and then tearing it up like they did with the Indians in America and the Trail of Tears and so forth.
Yeah.
That's just not on.
Yeah.
That just is not on. I mean, there's all this covert stuff about the intervention in the Northern Territory. That's disgusting.
It was.
The whole thing.
Still is.
And it doesn't run out until, I believe, the end of June, does it?
I'm pretty sure it's at the end of its life.
Yeah.
Because they saw that does not work.
Yeah, exactly. That doesn't work. The cards that limit your expenditure don't work.
Yeah.
And all these things they've tried, and basically they're all about control.
Yes.
They're all about saying, you can't run your own life. Look at the way you're carrying on. Oh, look at this, look at that. If you're not even doing anything wrong, they'll make it up.
Yes.
I mean, like that scumbag who did that interview from Mutijulu, he went on to get himself a nice plum job in the government somewhere, working for Mel Bruff. And he made that up. That was all made up. There's no evidence of anyone giving kids petrol in exchange for sex or any of that.
Yes, I remember that. And we could probably add others to the mix where they went in, saw something that they regarded as dysfunctional. They'd move in a CEO overnight. I don't know. I don't want to say frame the existing mayor or something, but have them move out of their place, go in, do their business, a money grab, and then gone.
Yep.
So them things are still occurring. They have occurred. I think they will remain as far as because the Aboriginal, you mentioned it as we were yarning before, it's a business now to be involved in Aboriginal affairs.
The Aboriginal industry.
The Aboriginal industry. There, put that one in your vocab, because it has been alive and well for many, many years. A lot of professionals have used the Aboriginal industry to feather their own nests. They really do not make any impact. A lot of them are agents of departments and governments of the time. So what they do is they breathe in and breathe out. And all of it is just a total money grab. So what that brings us to now is that where we have these things occurring, how do we try and keep the operation of truth-telling within the issues of now that has come back? You've mentioned it, treaty, the issues of reconciliation, the issues of environmental management. If we can just put those three together and the working, because we are of the same thought, Brin.
Okay, so some of the really good stuff that's happening that gives me a lot of encouragement is people like Victor Stephenson's work, where he is now talking to the heads of fire authorities about Indigenous burning practices as a better way of managing the bushfire hazards in Australia. And they're listening to him, because what happened here 2 years ago down south, was it 2 years ago?
I think so.
Yeah, 2.5 years ago.
The big bushfires that ravaged.
Remember, it started in July even, the bushfires.
Yeah, and that was cold time.
Yeah, I know. It was first time ever. It started that early, and it just kept burning worse and worse and worse. Yes. So they've now realised that whatever they were doing wasn't working. And, like that definition of stupidity is doing the same thing again and expecting a different outcome. Well, they've been doing the same thing for decades. Controlled burns, controlled burns, controlled burns. And I actually did most of a postgrad diploma in land rehabilitation at Ballarat Uni many, many years ago. And one of the interesting things that we looked at was how controlled burning reduces biodiversity. It actually gets rid of understory and substory, and it produces a higher fuel load eventually. And that's what you're trying to avoid. So you're actually creating a situation to make fires even worse. So essentially what I think they're trying to do is have a ground fire rather than a crown fire.
That's a good way of putting it.
Because crown fires are horrendous.
We've noticed that, because when we were young, we used to travel down to Sydney, Melbourne, Canberra, because we was involved in a lot of activities that were happening back in the 70s. And that was one of the things that we've noticed when we used to drive down there. The trees down over the border, especially when it started getting into cold country, they form these big, enormous barks. And these barks, they start peeling off in huge quantities. It looks like they're ring barking themselves. And as soon as we seen that, we said, whoa, this is bad. Bushfire country, this one. And so we've noticed that way back in the 70s, because we've taken into consideration that not only that this undergrowth that was wild and just going, because we were always hunters. We used to go out hunting, and one of the main practices that we've done even back then, and we used to hunt outside of Ipswich and everything, we would do a burn so it would make it easy for us to go and hunt when wintertime. Wintertime was the best time to hunt. Porcupine fat, plenty of wallaby. This is all before they started having their babies, before the spring. That's the best time to hunt. So we would have these burns, and we'd go out hunting. But we noticed that they weren't hunting down there. And we seen the undergrowth and the bark just coming off in huge quantities. So we understood that too. And here you're saying that the young fella, Stephenson, who I think, by the way, was taught by Mukai, Wawo Mukai, TG, in Laura.
Tony George,
Yes.
That's right,
He was taught by him a brilliant piece of knowledge transfer. And now that man is taking that knowledge and using it in a big way, because we've seen what the bushfire's done, and maybe his actions employing those techniques will actually save lives.
And he's also been over to America, even to Oregon and Washington and California, talking to the indigenous peoples there about fire management.
Yes.
So, yeah, there's things like that. And there's other people doing all sorts of different things with water management and waste management. And that all gives me hope. It really does.
Yes.
But where were we? We were talking, the trees. One thing about that is one interesting thing I learned when I was doing the botanical side of it, was that the stringy barks, they shed their bark so the fire can't get up the tree to the canopy.
Okay, so fire burns up.
Yeah. And so they try to keep it down on the ground.
Yes.
And the messmates, with all the little tight bark and the little corners and stuff, that's so the fire gets into a corner and it gets stuck. It can't go any further. Which is, when you look at it, you think, well, it's pretty obvious. Yeah, that's what would happen. Because you look at a burnt messmate, it gets to a certain height and it stops.
And it stays there.
Because it can't go up to the next level. So,
But where the fuel is going to come? Down below. And
down below. The fuel down below is because of you reducing the biodiversity and you're selecting fire-tolerant species.
All right.
Rather than the ones that, suffer from the fire and that don't reproduce as easily. So, that's your problem. So you're just building up this. Then you get the weeds. I mean, gamba grass, it's a classic bloody monster. I mean, you think that greater grass is a fire risk. I mean, gamba grass is humongous. It just burns everything. I mean, up in the Northern Territory, they won't even try and put out a gamba grass fire anymore. They'll burn back onto it. Let it go. They'll burn back onto it to try and confine it, because they almost lost a few fire engines going in, getting too close to them.
Wow.
Yeah. Oh, it is scary. It's very intense fire. Because it's, gamba grass gets up to about 3 meters, 4 meters tall.
I'm not sure. See, these are the things that
It's up the Cape as well.
Yeah, but this is what I was saying before. Is because of your insight, you are able to make it clear what are we to look for. Because sometimes the landscape, we look at the landscape in a totally different with totally different eyes. And take into effect the management side. Now we are actually coming together with two sides of management, aren't we?
Absolutely.
Yeah, the ancient indigenous land management practices and the new identified practices that can utilise technology and whatever.
Yes, and one of the key issues that you have to deal with, obviously, is the introduction of invasive species, which were never there historically. There are a number of species introduced over the history of the black community. Like dingoes is the obvious one. But certainly there weren't cats and foxes and rabbits and the rats that we got, the Norwegian rats and the ship rats, and what else have we got? The mice plagues.
Yes.
Then you start getting into the weeds. Yeah.
We've got a big mishmash of problems that the environment has to deal with. We as caretakers of the country, we have responsibilities that both black and white. One of the way that Kunjur Men's Group operates is that we welcome all different thoughts, all different ideas. It does not belong to us as human beings just to have a containment of ideas and say, this is what we're going to use. We've got to look at the whole gamut, the whole spectrum on how we are going to deal with this precious commodity and asset we call the earth. But just coming a little bit further, maybe bringing it up to now, Brin, what is in your sights? What are you doing at this moment now?
Not as much as I did 20 years ago, that's for sure.
Yeah, the old
'Cause I'm
bodies.
getting old and the brain gets a bit foggy and the body gets decidedly sore in spots when you try to move around the place. But no, one of the things I'm involved with is the local Bats and Trees group that's trying to protect the flying foxes.
Yes.
I support them as best as I can. I'm the treasurer, so I make sure that the money gets spent,
in the
where it
right
should
way.
be spent in the right way.
Yeah.
Which is really important because I have great respect for the people, the wildlife carers. I mean, I couldn't do it. I couldn't get up 5 times a night to bottle feed a
You've got to be an animal
wallaby
lover.
or whatever. Yeah, you have to be. Yeah, it's such dedicated work.
Yeah.
And then you've got to cope with them when they die as well. You've got to be able to euthanize them if need
my
be.
word. And I can understand the attachment and the loss.
Yep. But they seem to be relatively indestructible. They just keep on going. And I know people are looking after dozens, if not hundreds of animals at a time sometimes.
And you enjoying what you're doing?
Yeah, I am. I think it's useful. And I mean, it's one of the things then always wanted out of life is to actually feel like I'm being useful and I'm not an oxygen thief.
No, you're not taking up space. You're not taking up anybody else's oxygen. You are actually an asset to us. Yep. I've known you for a good few years now, Brin. From what you have done, for where you have come from, and how you have placed yourself within the workings of concerned human beings. My name is Graham Brady. My good mate, my good friend, Brin Matthews. We share the same ideals, and we attempt our best to keep this earth safe, don't we?
Absolutely.
Yes.
We owe it to the next generations and those beyond them and beyond them and beyond them.
My word. On behalf of Kunjur Men's Group, this is Graham Brady and Brin Matthews. See you later.